6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History with Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. So hello everyone, welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast. Today we welcome author and historian Martyn Whittock to discuss his book, and I breezed through it, I've got it right here, American Vikings, How the Norse Sailed into the Lands and the Imagination of America. I'm really excited to get stuck into this episode, but how are you doing, Martyn?
I'm very well, thank you for having me on the podcast.
No worries. I'm really excited to have this chat because it's a different type of history, but I want to ask you first, as I do for all guests, what inspired you to write this book and get interested in the Vikings?
Two main things. Firstly, I have for some time been very interested in the Viking Age from about 750 to 1100. And this explosion of people out of Scandinavia, traders and explorers, as well as raiders, right across Western Europe, from the Caspian Sea in the east, right across Europe to North America, Iceland, Greenland, Ireland, into the Mediterranean. Astonished by, as many people are, and intrigued by the dynamism and the energy that drove this and the impact that had upon so many other communities at the time. So I was interested in the Vikings for that reason, but I was also become increasingly interested in recent times on what you might call deep stories, the ways by which we use, abuse, engage with history in order to define or frame the present. And I realized, not surprisingly, that Vikings were part of the deep story of a lot of communities in many areas, not just in Europe. And as I was exploring Viking movements, I came across saga references to sailing to Vinland, to North America, and looking at that, I realized that the Vikings had entered into the deep story of some aspects of America, modern America, as well as they have in the deep stories of Scandinavia and Russia and Ukraine. We might talk about that later, and many areas of Western Europe. So these sort of two strands came together. Fascination with the energy and drive and impact of the Vikings in the Viking Age, and also a real interest in how they had contributed to the deep stories of many modern communities today.
That was something that I became incredibly interested in while reading your book, the depth of this history for two ideological opponents for the last 100 years, the Americans and the Russians. But I think before we start getting into that depth, the term Viking has been quite a contentious term over the last, few decades. But what is and who were the Vikings?
I use the term Viking because it is such a handy label and because it is the label of choice for so many people today. But I do make the point in the book, and I'll make the point very clearly now, that Viking is actually more of what you did than of what you were. It's more of a job description, as it were, than a statement of ethnicity. And to go Viking effectively was to go on a spot of muscular free enterprise, which might well occupy certain stages in the lives of certain men, possibly women too. There's some debate about that involvement of women in the Viking attacks, as it were, in the military side of it. So it basically described a time in a person's lifetime when they were part of a band of people going out raiding, trading, exploring, but there was certainly raiding and violence in there as well as trading. So Viking was something that people did rather than what you were. So technically, we should be talking about the Norse, speakers of Old Norse, people who came from the Scandinavian heartlands. But because the term Viking is now so much in the public domain, and we find it in phrases like, the Viking Age, and we talk about, Viking raids and Viking settlements and so on, I've used it, but with that explanation that I am using a phrase for convenience, which at the time, many of the traders and settlers would not have applied to themselves. And also, interesting enough, many of those people who are on the receiving end of the Viking raids, the violent side of it, would have had different words and terms to use for people who were doing it. So it's a useful label, but it must come with the health warning that historically it has a much more limited focus and use compared to how we tend to use it today as a catch-all phrase for Norse communities from about 750 to about 1100.
I think that's a really, really important piece of context there because, as you said, so many people use and misuse and appropriate that term. And it's really nice to get that depth of understanding. But what was their world like? How did they understand the world at this point that you're writing?
We tend to look at the explosion of activities in the Viking Age when suddenly there's this impact of primarily raiders and pirates, if you like, on communities either side of the North Sea, the English Channel, and abroad, and the settlement that came with it as well, often afterwards, as if it came out of nowhere. But it's quite clear that isn't the case. That for a long time, Scandinavians had been very much aware of communities to the south, and communities to the south had been very much aware of Scandinavians to the north. We know, for example, of Roman metalwork turning up in Denmark in some quantities. We can imagine mercenaries from the north serving in armies of the late Roman Empire and so on. So it's not as if Scandinavia suddenly woke up in about the year 750 and thought, wow, there's an awful lot of stuff I can nick to the south. Let's go and steal it. There was a history of interaction, of trade, of involvement, of going both ways. The products of the north often going south in terms of trade, southern silver going north in terms of that trade as well, and the movement of peoples as well. But clearly, something happened around the middle of the 8th century, which suddenly caused these northern peoples to appear on the radar, as it were, of many, many communities to the south. Lots of debates about this, all sorts of factors feeding into this. But it is important to remember that those in the north were aware of communities to the south, and those in the south were very much aware of communities to the north. So, what caused that movement? What caused that expansion? Number of factors fed into that. We know, for example, that there were climatic issues going on associated with volcanic activity, which caused some real problems in the northern hemisphere and northern Europe, and around the time of the start of the Viking Age. We have some evidence for rising population as well, out competing resources in Scandinavia. We also know that some amazing changes that took place in the caliphate of the Islamic world, way to the south and east of the Viking heartland, caused a disruption of the flow of silver for a period of time into Scandinavia. And that destabilized a lot of trading activity in Scandinavia. And it caused a real problem for elites who often had relied upon shipping products, including human beings, out of Scandinavia as slaves, as well as other items, and getting silver in return. And undoubtedly, there was a factor economically as well. How do we get hold of the kind of silver that's important in gift giving in the north? If the trade opportunities have cut down, we need other ways of doing it. There may also be an ideological pressure as well. Big debates about this. We know, for example, that Frankish rulers were putting increasing pressure on southern Scandinavia, particularly on Denmark, for example, to convert to Christianity. And there also seems to have been something of perhaps an ideological pushback as well from communities that felt themselves under pressure from the south. So seeing the world from the Scandinavian point of view, you can see all sorts of opportunities and threats from the south. You can see lots of trading opportunities, particularly to the southeast into the Baltic, but being disrupted by these changes in the Islamic Caliphate. And this seems to have triggered a movement of people out of Scandinavia to raid and to steal and then to settle in the communities which were to their south and their southeast and their southwest.
And I think changing that perspective of this history into being a Scandinavian focused history away from, maybe some of those Christian centric stories that we've had is very important. But then at the heart of your book is a kind of westward expansion, a term that we usually associate with American imperialism. So that westward push, is that linking to those push factors of migration that you were talking about there?
Yes, both push and pull. I deliberately sort of used the phrase in the book, go west, young man, and young women as well, because they're involved in the movement as well. Some of them very, very significantly so. But go west because it automatically has that image in one's mind of, covered wagons and conflict between Europeans and Native Americans. To make the point that this westward movement, with all its conflicted character, has a much longer and earlier history as well, including in the Viking Age. So the movement of Vikings westward, particularly Norwegian Vikings and Danish Vikings, as a generalization, for a long time, Swedish Vikings tended to move further to the east into the Baltic, but these are gross generalizations. But basically, the movement westward had this push factor of problems in resources back in Scandinavia. Also, very early kingdom building in Scandinavia meant that those people that lost out in that kingdom building had to go abroad to seek their fortune. And then later on, early kings had more powerful resources to also mount their raids as well. So that was quite a complicated push factor. There was this push factor out, in this case to the west. There was the pull factor of wealthy, organized communities in, for example, Anglo-Saxon England, which was very, very important as part of our story. Anglo-Saxon England, a very wealthy community. We have communities in Ireland as well that are sophisticated communities. And those are part of the pull factors as well. So if there are reasons for coming out of Scandinavia, there are also attractions in the areas they're coming to in terms of wealth, either by trade or by raiding, and eventually by settlement. And I think it's important to remember that the very same boatload that raided in one place might well have been trading a bit further down the coast. And this complexity of flexibility is part of it as well. So, for example, towards the end of the 8th century, we hear of the King's Reeve from Dorchester in Dorset going down to Portland to sort out the tax system, talk out the tax situation in a group of northerners who had landed on Portland. And they killed him. Now, I have no doubt that further up the coast, they'd been trading in walrus ivory and amber and who knows what. But they arrived in Portland, they sensed an opportunity. A guy tried to sort them out and make them come to Dorchester and sort out their tax credentials. And clearly they said, I'm not having any of that. And it all ended very, very badly indeed. And that was actually earlier than the 793 raid on Lindisfarne. So we have to think of people who are very opportunistic, which is why I've used this phrase muscular free enterprise, because it's this opportunity to make the most of opportunities as they arise and as they appear. And that takes Western movement to the British Isles, impacting on what we now call Scotland, England, Wales, Ireland, but also from there to Iceland, where we know there was significant movement of Scandinavian settlers, some of who had come straight from the homelands in Norway, some from the British Isles. Getting there in the 870s, we got that fairly securely dated now from volcanic deposits in Reykjavik, for example. And then from there, by accident or design, a mix to Greenland, looking again for more resources, sometimes leaving behind because you were in trouble. And if you were outlawed or things had got too hot to handle in Norway or Iceland, then it's time to move west. Again, it has very American 19th century feels to it. And then eventually, as we'll discuss in a moment, by accident to start with, and then by design, movement even further west again, probably pursuing at some point the trade objects of the Arctic and subarctic from First Nations people and Native Americans. A desire for wood, for example, that we know was present in places like Labrador and certainly in Newfoundland in quantities then that it wasn't in Greenland. Again, push factors and pull factors eventually cause these people who have had their original homes in perhaps Ireland or Iceland or Greenland to discover lands even further to the west in what we would now call the North American continent. So this westward push is also there are attractions to those who are on the move.
And then you mentioning that muscular enterprise, I think is a really important kind of term to understand the Vikings and that opportunistic way. But when you're discussing there Greenland and Iceland, I think it's important that we start to understand those communities before pushing onto America. You know, how do these communities come about, and are they like a form of colonization? Are they separate kingdoms? What are they like?
This really has quite a lot of the characteristics of, if you like, the American westward settlement in the 19th century. Some of this is organized by elites. Some of this is done on a lower scale by people who just are on the move because they want more land or because they're in trouble back home, for example. So we need to see these people as colonizers who will often become the dominant force where they can dominate indigenous peoples, for example, in parts of the Northern Isles of Scotland, for example, where the Picts seem to have had entered a real period of terminal decline in the face of Viking intrusions into the Northern Isles. But in other areas, they are very adept at collaborating and working. So in Ireland, for example, they soon become part of the patchwork of warring princedoms and kingdoms in Ireland, but bringing trade and stimulus to towns that are now very important. Places like Dublin and Wexford are effectively Norse settlements, but we shouldn't see them as being solely isolated from the Irish communities. Absolutely not. They raid, they integrate, they intermarry, they become part of that wider community. But Iceland and Greenland is a little different, because when the Norse go to Iceland and to Greenland, particularly Iceland, they find there a place where they can. It's quite a harsh and a challenging environment. But if your background is in Norway, for example, then you're used to pretty tough environments and making a success out of it. They go there and they do not find indigenous peoples at this time in any significant numbers, possibly almost none at all in Iceland. There is some debate about whether the people they call the Papa are in Irish missionaries who'd got as far as excuse me, as far as Iceland to find isolated places where they could pray and become part of monastic communities. Well, that doesn't end well, it seems, when the Norse arrive. And they talk about people called the Papa, but they don't talk about any other indigenous peoples at all. So we assume when they come to Iceland, they come to a community that basically is open for the taking, if you see what I mean. It has resources which people from the north of Europe will find very attractive. There will be walruses, there will be lots of fishing stocks. There is some wood as well, not a lot of wood. In fact, there's a joke that says if you get lost in an Icelandic forest, it's okay, just stand up, because so many Icelandic forests are quite small scale and stunted. That's a gross generalization. Icelanders even now will be writing into you, but they find communities in Iceland, or they founded communities, because they can do so because there isn't much competition. They then move on to Greenland, which has attractions too. That's a little bit more complicated because we know that to the north of Greenland, there are already Paleo Inuit people moving. So there is more of an interplay there to start with, at least, though in the end, it's the Inuit who succeed and the Norse who fail by the 14th century. But they're coming as colonizers who have to find some kind of way of working with indigenous peoples, but they're not under too much pressure to start with, the Norse. And then when they go to North America, as we'll see in a moment, they go in such small numbers that they are very much in a colonial position, but against peoples who can mount a significant pushback against them in a more successful way than those same peoples will be able to do so later in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, when the arrival of much larger numbers of Europeans with their diseases cause devastation to Native American and First Nations communities. That does not seem to be the case when the Vikings first appear in around the year 1000. Then they are small in number and they have to find some way of working with the people they're working with and they're struggling with.
From that point, I think there's a couple of thoughts there that I really want to pull on. Firstly, I think it's important to ask the question, how did they get there? Because when you look at these journeys and you look at a map between Norway, Denmark, the British Isles, Greenland, Iceland, and then onto places like Newfoundland and Labrador, it is a long way. Vikings had a very particular design of ship, designed for certain waters.
Basically, we have people here who are very expert sea people here who are very, very familiar with travel and navigation in ways that nowadays we find hard to imagine, in terms of colour of the water, movement of birds, movement of whales, appearances of the stars, and so on. So many of the ways that they would use, we can now only guess at. Often they are hopping from place to place, from island to island, but that does not explain how you get to Iceland, and it does not explain how you get to Greenland. It does not explain how you get to North America. So we are talking about people who really are extremely adept at making tough ocean-going boats which are capable of traveling these distances. I think what we need to envisage, though, is less of the sleek, long ships that we sometimes imagine, and rightly so, from things that are found in Scandinavia, as responsible for the raiding in Western Europe. A more sturdy, deeper drafted, bulkier Nars merchant ships, which will have hatches which you can batten down and get below as well. So whilst it may well have been that some of the kind of ships we imagine get them to these places, we're much more likely to have a realistic view in our minds if we think about some of the merchant trading vessels, which we also know were being used at the period of time, which are less likely to take on board seas and so on and so forth. Having said that, I mean, longships were very impressive and could do some dramatic work, but I think probably envisage more of work-a-day vessels getting people and livestock and things to some of these places. The other thing is how many boats were lost. I mean, this is true of like, transoceanic exploration in the Pacific, for example. People get to Polynesia and Micronesia in prehistory. How many didn't? How many didn't? And I think that's the kind of thing one also has to bear in mind as well, that we're getting the records and the traditions of those that made it and lived. We don't hear those people that were overwhelmed by appalling seas in the North Atlantic and so on. So that is very much part of the Norse trading tradition, to have impressive boats that are capable of doing impressive things, allied to maritime skills which allow them to do movements that are really quite impressive to us today. Having said that, it's likely when they got to Vinland, from some of the early accounts, it was by accident. So they were blown there. There's some evidence that the first traders got there and thought, I haven't got a clue where I am. It doesn't look like Greenland. Let's go back the other way. And ones that came later did it deliberately. To start with, probably by accident. And I expect a lot of these discoveries were by accident as well.
So when they've got to Vinland and North America, what are they doing there? What are these?
Okay, Vinland has a number of attractions. So we have two main sagas that talk about this. Icelandic sagas written in the 13th century, Eric the Red saga and the saga of Greenlanders, talk about this mixture of different ways in which settlers from Greenland eventually find lands far to the west. And they describe them with names like Helluland, Markland, and Vinland. And they do not sound mythological. They sound very, very real. And because of that, we are confident we're talking about places like Baffin Island, Labrador, and eventually Newfoundland, from the descriptions, which are very impressive. They get there, and basically they are looking for some of the products of these areas. We know that they are attracted to things like the products of the subarctic, things like polar bear pelts, things like walrus ivory, the down of birds, and so on and so forth, and wood as well. So these first people get there by accident, and then other people say there is something to the west of here, and that appears to be developed very much in Saga of the Greenlanders and in Eric the Red saga, that by about the year 1000, there was an attempt to actually go further west and see if this is a place that is capable of receiving colonization in the same way as they've colonized Greenland, but which has more resources. And they're impressed by what they find. They find extraordinary fish stocks. They find lots of game, find wild wheat growing, wild grapes growing, from which we think they must have gone down at least as far south as New Brunswick and the area of Maine, perhaps, or northern New England, and possibly even as far south as Cape Cod. But there's big debates about that. They find it to be attractive. It's got a better climate, they say, than Greenland, which is a much harsher climate. And they find wood in abundance. So all the expeditions talk about the things they find there, but one of the things they keep talking about is taking wood back to Greenland, which sounds quite intriguing. And that's because basically Greenland has such an adequate woodland, and there aren't wood stocks they can use, and driftwood isn't enough to maintain life on Greenland. So effectively, they're taking wood as well as the products of North America and the Arctic and Canadian subarctic. And we've now found, for example, on Proto-Inuit sites and First Nations sites in Canada and the Canadian Arctic and subarctic, a number of Norse items that suggest a lot of trade was going on, totally unrecorded in any of the sagas. But the sagas are fascinated by Vinland, because as they go further south to Newfoundland and below, they find a land that they are very impressed with in terms of its natural resources. But it is a land that is already very much peopled with people they call Skraelings. So this settlement is going to come at a cost, and we see warfare and fighting happening as well. But women take part in the exploration as well. So the first ones are by men, but then we see mixed groups of men and women sailing to Vinland. So clearly there is a hope that there may be a colonization opportunity here. And we hear a bull being taken to Vinland as well, and frightening Native Americans who've never seen one before. So clearly there's the hope that there will be a colonization here, although in the end that does not succeed.
Is there any physical evidence, either in Greenland or in North America, that these Vikings were there? Because, this has been ground. People tend to
Yeah,
think it's a bit of a
absolutely
myth.
solid evidence for Greenland. We definitely know of extensive Norse longhouses there, which finally were eclipsed in the 14th century in the start of the so-called Little Ice Age, when it just became far too difficult to maintain these settlements. And also Inuit people moving south, and there's competition, possibly even conflict. So in terms of Greenland, absolutely no question whatsoever. In terms of the Canadian Arctic and subarctic, more and more evidence turning up now for things that are from, we think pretty sure now, from Northern Europe, from the Norse world, that are there either because they're traded hand over hand or because actual Norse settlers are there on Labrador, on places like Baffin Island, Devon Island as well. We found that in things that have been excavated from Native American sites. Where we have very solid evidence now is from Newfoundland. Launceston Meadows in northern tip of Newfoundland first attracted attention in the 1930s. Since the 1960s, has been excavated scientifically, now recognised by Parks Canada and the World Archaeological Community as the first proven European settlement in North America. We know 3 hut complexes there. We know that people were working bog iron there, and they were there. We know now in 2021, it was dated from dendrochronological evidence to 1021. So trees were definitely being cut down by European metal axes on Newfoundland in 1021 to make buildings which have no parallels with Native American building traditions, but are fully consistent with Norse building techniques from Greenland, Iceland, and from Norway. We know they were definitely there. But what's intriguing is the archaeology is very thin. So for a long time, people thought they were only there for a very short period of time. But recently, within the last 4 or 5 years, work has been done on the legacy radiocarbon dating there, which shows that something was going on there for almost a century. So what we probably have here is a base camp that people put into Newfoundland, repaired ships, rested, and then moved on somewhere else, which explains the thin archaeology, by which I mean that these are not farmsteads, these are not large communities, but they are there periodically for at least a century, until perhaps even the 1120s, which means they're going on further. And that raises the intriguing question of how far down the east coast of the USA and how far into the North American continent. That in 1957, the so-called Goddard coin or Maine penny is found at a Native American site in the USA. For a while, people think, oh, maybe it was planted, maybe it was salted there to be found, but recent evidence suggests it had lain in its position there for a very, very, very long time before it was found in 1957. It's a coin of a Norwegian king from the late 11th century. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean to say that Norse people were at the Goddard site. It was probably traded hand over hand by people, First Nations, Native American people, Inuits to the north. But nevertheless, we're beginning to pick up signs now the Norse were definitely there in North America. The debate is how far south and how far into the continent. And there, the debate gets just a little heated.
And I think it's really interesting to see that downward movement through America, down the coast, because I think it, as you said, it raises up so many questions that are striking at the very heart of what we consider to be the history of this region. Before we jump into, before we jump into those debates, I wanted to ask about their relationship with the first people, the Native Americans, because it seems that muscular enterprise that you spoke about earlier does kind of extend.
Just as English colonists took their experiences of being colonizers of Ireland to Native Americans and applied the same kind of ruthless brutality, tragically, so some of the Norse took the same kind of experiences that they'd had of dealing with indigenous peoples in the old world, in inverted commas, and applied it to the new world. So although there is trading going on, although the sagas talk about trade between the two communities, they also talk about violence. We hear tales of Norse settlers coming upon Native Americans people sleeping under a boat on a beach and killing them. So we have the same kind of extreme violence, and not surprisingly, it has pushback from Native American peoples who are not going to take this lying down. And what this illustrates is that the Norse are not in a position in North America to impose. It would only have survived, if it was ever possible of re-surviving, as a cooperative venture with people there. Once it turns into a conflict, it becomes untenable. They are too far west on their supply lines. Greenland does not have a high enough Norse population to fuel demographically this movement to the west. And by about the 1120s, it appears to have petered out and collapsed. And some of this, no doubt, would have been as pushback by First Nations and Native American peoples against violence which has been done to them by the arrivals. Interesting, the sagas, and I think I'm right in this, never talk about violence being initiated by the Native Americans. It seems to have come from the Norse first. Now, I may have misread some of that, but certainly it is pretty clear that some of the Norse settlers apply the same kind of behavior in Native Americans, as later English settlers will apply in Virginia, for example, and it leads to conflict and violence. But the Norse community does not survive. It is abandoned.
And I think, that method of being violent and being aggressors is, as you said, that repetition of history going on with the British, the Spanish. But as we've discussed several times now, it's really striking at the chord of the American creation myth. So, how does America itself interact with that myth? Because, you've had Columbus Day and so on. It's striking at the chord of what America
very much so.
has believed.
What's interesting is that from the 1770s onwards, there is a Norse component. 1770s, so the time of the breaking away from British rule, the American War of Independence, the American Revolution. There's the beginning of a search for an origin myth that does not involve Columbus, does not involve John Cabot. Cabot, of course, sent there, definitely did get to North America in the late 15th century, but he's there on the behest of English monarchs. That doesn't go down too well. We've just broken away from from King George. Well, that's Cabot. Columbus, well, never really makes it to the North American continent, and he's rather Catholic and rather South European. Now, that's not a problem at all, unless you come from a particular East Coast demographic within America that would rather like it to be rather more North European and Protestant. And so there's a pushback against Columbus and against Cabot from the 1770s onwards. In fact, Franklin talks about a tradition that he'd heard that Norse got there before these other people. So it's there amongst the founding fathers as well. In the 1830s, the sagas are translated, the Icelandic sagas are translated from Norse into English, and there are editions published in America, USA, the newly minted USA. Very, very popular for the reason that I've just talked about. After the 1860s, in the Dakota Wars in Minnesota, for example, after the 1860s, Dakota War against Native Americans, a lot of Scandinavians move into the Midwest, and there's a desire to declare their Scandinavianness in the new homelands. And then we start to see the finding, in inverted commas, of runestones, for example. The most famous one from Kensington in Minnesota from the 1890s. Most experts consider to be a fake. Found, of course, by a Scandinavian in an area of Scandinavian settlement, saying that Scandinavians were here in the 14th century, and therefore giving prior claim to the land even before Native Americans of the particular tribes with which there had been recent conflicts had got there. Well, of course, it's an attempt to create prior ownership in a way that puts current ownership, as it were, beyond question. It then gets picked up again in the 90s by by American politicians of the right, who want to tie into the popular ideas of Germanization, Aryanization, which is rising in Europe in the 20s and the 1930s, particularly in the 1930s after the rise of Hitler to the chancellorship in 1933. We see aspects of it in the America First movement in the early 1940s, again seeking an origin in white, muscular, Protestant power. Now, of course, The people that went there in 1100 weren't Protestants, they were Catholics. But by the 19th century, all the Scandinavian states were solidly Protestant, so that's okay. That's okay. So you can push back against South Europeans with them, you can push back against Catholics with them, you can push back against Native Americans with them, and they become interwoven into this very complicated right-wing story of America, alongside the genuine interest in Norse settlement in North America that then gets picked up by comic book culture and so on, without the right-wing political overtones in the 1950s and 1960s. So there's this very complicated way in which they begin to speak to the American experience, as it were, and the American experience seeks validation in them, such that by the 1960s, Vikings are increasingly speaking, if you like, with an American accent.
I think that really shows that depth of American history. You know,
Hmm.
I'm a fan of sports, and you see the Minnesota Vikings with that Viking emblem.
Yes,
You see,
absolutely.
recently with Thor in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. As personally, as a historian of dictatorships and Trump, you mentioned something in your book that I think I'd be a bad historian if I didn't want to touch on a little bit deeper. You draw this line between the Vikings and the January 6th insurrection.
First of all, I must say that because people misuse an area of history or abuse an area of history should not make us frightened to engage with it in open, honest, historical conversation. So I would not want to lose the baby with the bathwater, as the saying goes, because some people have used and abused this particular area of history. But without a shadow of a doubt, in recent times, in the last 10, 15 years, the concept of these muscular, white, powerful men has been picked up again. And of course, that completely ignores, the trading and the settling and the side of it. It looks very much like the Viking image, but that's been picked up very much again by the alt-right, as it had been picked up in the 1930s by the American First Movement and neo-Nazis in the USA. And we know, for example, that that has got a whole new lease of life there. Charlottesville in 2017, the Unite the Right rally there, saw a lot of people with Viking symbols on their shields, as well as Crusader symbols. What's that all about? We know, for example, of violence in Portland, for example, a murder on a train there in this century, in recent times, where the perpetrator said he was doing it for Vinland. He was doing it because he was pushing back against what he was unhappy about in Native American society. It's an American version of the things that happened in the Christchurch, New Zealand killings around the same time, when the person there also posted that he was doing it for Vinland, this kind of see you in Valhalla kind of mentality to people online. And clearly, it has been very much used in recent times by the alt-right to declare there is an origin myth which is white, which is muscular, which is male. January the 6th. Viking symbols appearing there. Many people will have seen the Q shaman or Q shaman, and they'll have recognized the helmet, sorry, the hat with the horns that seems to be more Native American in inspiration. But what they fail to do often is they look at the not to look at the body, and here we have Yggdrasil, the great world tree from Norse mythology, tattooed on the man's body. We see Valknut, which is a pagan Norse symbol. We see Thor's hammer. And what that illustrates is that even at the capital on the 6th of January 2021, you see echoes of the Norse past in North America, as people are seeking to reference it in order to justify very modern, very extreme political ideologies. And it's one of the strange ironies of history that in T21, the year of January the 6th, we first had the first definitively dated proof of Norse in North America in 1021, exactly 1,000 years before the first datable proof and the latest iteration of the use of this image in alt-right politics. Quite extraordinary. The journey of the Norse into the North American imagination has gone even further than it has into the North American continent.
I think that depth there has really been highlighted just by you pointing out that it was 1,000 years, at that point. And I think that depth into the American imagination it's shaping a lot of discourse in both Europe and America. But at that point, I think it's time to ask you a final fun question, as we do for all our guests, Martyn. Clearly, you have written an awful lot of books focusing on the Vikings. But what is your favourite Viking historical?
My favourite Viking historical fact is from the extreme east. In AD 740, the director of posts of the Abbasid Caliphate, based in Baghdad, wrote about Vikings turning up in Baghdad on camels. He described them as the Rus. We know the Rus were Norse settlers, traders, raiders, who set up mixed Norse Slavic communities on the river systems of Russia and Ukraine, and are part of the contested story of Russia and Ukraine to today. But that is another story. But the Rus moved down to Constantinople, they traded to the Caspian Sea, and in 740 they rocked up in Baghdad, of all places, seeking to trade. They claimed they were Christians. They almost certainly weren't. They probably did so because they would get tax breaks as a Christian, as people of the book, because the Islamic system basically said that Jews and Christians were also people of the book and therefore could have advantageous trading arrangements in the Islamic community. Vikings turn up in Baghdad on camels trying to trade with the Islamic Caliphate. You couldn't make it up. Absolutely extraordinary. Newfoundland in the west, Baghdad in the east. What an extraordinary story.
That is an incredible reach of networks there. I'm rather jealous of both those experiences. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Okay, American Vikings, How the Norse Sailed into the Lands and Imaginations of America, is published by Pegasus Books of New York, distributed by Simon & Schuster. So it's available globally. Your local bookstore could get it if you wanted it, written by Martyn Whittock, American Vikings, Pegasus Books, New York. They can get it. It is also available online by a range of different online sellers. I won't just name the obvious one because it's unfair to all the others, but the obvious one has it as well. And so do all the others. So yeah, American Vikings by Martyn Whittock, MartynWhittock, distributed by Simon & Schuster, but by Pegasus Books, New York, available wherever books can be bought.
Fantastic. Well, I'll make sure a link for it is in the description below so people can go away and grab a copy, because it is a truly fantastic book.
Thank you very much. Oh, it's now available in paperback as well. So it's in hardback in 2023, and since October 2024, it's available in paperback, which obviously is cheaper and easier to carry around. Exactly, yes. So it's now available in hardback or paperback. Thank you for having me on the podcast. It's been a great honour. I hope people have found it interesting. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it. So thank you, Martyn.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History of Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way.